Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Brother. I'm the chair of the Department of Medicine. Welcome to our ongoing series of remote chairs grand rounds. As we settle into this new normal, which is an overused phrase, it's going to be interesting to see how much of this kind of presentation becomes an expectation and a norm versus how much we'll go back to once things settle down. But for now, rounds are working out really well. We've got really great attendance again today, which I'm really pleased to see. Just a couple of quick outlines around etiquette. Again, I will try to mute people if they come in, if they aren't muted. At the end, you will have an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any. We are recording this and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. If you have questions and you don't have a working mic or you don't want to ask them verbally, please just type them into chat. I will coalesce them and I'll present them at the end. We are going to try over the next couple of weeks a new Zoom feature that allows us to post questions and then upvote them, which I think actually would be useful to help bring questions that are more relevant to everyone to the top of the pile. So thank you to our speaker this morning, Dr. Arid El-Sheba, who is in charge of the university's equity, diversity, and inclusivity process. She sits on the senior executive team for the university and has been instrumental in bringing awareness to equity and diversity issues across the university, and has also led the development of a significant number of policies and procedures that have helped us to understand how we should move this file forward. I also note that Dr. Sonia Anand is online, and I might ask Sonia if she's still here at the end to make a few comments, given that Sonia has led the departmental initiative in this area. So without further comments, I'll ask Arid to take over. So Arid, please start.
Great, thank you, Mark. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's just so important that leaders across the institution embrace this as a joint purpose, and I appreciate the FaceTime to get in front of folks. So let me see if I can manage to move my slide along here. And that is our first technical, oh, there we go. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I have communicated to you folks in the promotional material that I'm going to try to cover three areas. I'll just be a little bit dynamic with the PowerPoint. I'll provide it. Well, it'll be recorded and available to you. So I might walk through some slides a little bit faster, but please feel free to be in touch with me afterwards if you have any particular questions on areas I didn't spend enough time on. So I said I wanted to talk with you folks about the case for EDI and the inclusive excellence imperative. So that will require me to talk a little bit about how we're defining equity, diversity, and inclusion, to describe what we mean by the inclusive excellence framework, and then just to reference, not to go into depth around the evidence, but to reference the evidence that is available that makes the case for EDI. We do get quite a lot of questions, and it makes sense to have this question that, you know, why are we doing this work? Why is it important? And how do we know what we're doing will actually work? So then I want to talk about how do we mobilize EDI change in an academic institution. And I'll talk with you about the work we're doing on our McMaster EDI strategy. And then use an example to discuss the best practices that we've integrated into a newly approved faculty hiring process, and the parallel processes we're trying to roll out for leader hiring as well. Talk very briefly about being a change agent and reference qualities of inclusive leadership in a particular study that I found quite useful, helpful. And then some time for questions and discussion. So getting right into it, defining EDI, what do we mean by equity, diversity, and inclusion? It's a mouthful. Oftentimes we just use a shorthand and a shortcut, and anything diversity related or equity related, we just call diversity. And I propose that we actually are more nuanced and make sure that we use the language that we actually mean. So diversity is simply layperson's terms, a state or condition. It's the broad mix and layers of differences among us, and that might include our personal identities, core values, personality traits. What we're talking about today will be the aspect of diversity, which is our social cultural identities. And of course, our life experiences, our histories, the circumstances that provide a context and combine to create our unique selves. So inclusion is a consequence of what we do with our diversity. It is a feeling or experience, one can say, as a consequence of some intentional, active, and skillful engagement that we will have across and with our differences, across our different peoples and different perspectives. And a key component of that is the sense or experience of dignity, as well as equal opportunity, quality of opportunity for all. And that's what takes us to equity. And equity is the approach, it's the worldview or the process that we need to engage in order to get to inclusion. And hopefully that'll become apparent as we move through the presentation. So an equity worldview acknowledges that there exist systemic social inequities, and that we need to then introduce actions, proactive work to remove the structural and cultural barriers. We need to identify them and then remove those structural and cultural barriers. If we can remove, oftentimes it's a mitigation that we're doing in order to establish equal opportunity and inclusion for folks. This is a really important piece because the notion of meritocracy, I'll talk about that a little bit more in the academy. Of course, we have the ideal of meritocracy, but there's something called the myth of meritocracy, which is the belief that we actually have a pure meritocracy. If we believe that we have a pure meritocracy, in fact, that's contradictory to the worldview, the equity worldview, because, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is meritocracy presumes that we shouldn't think about any equity issues, diversity issues, that they should have no bearing on the way that we evaluate applications and people and quality. However, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is that the research demonstrates that in fact we don't have a pure meritocracy, that those inequities actually are seeping into our evaluation processes. So we've established the definitions there. And so what are we doing and how are we thinking about diversity and excellence in the academy? Well, we're trying to get beyond the notion of it being a charitable proposition and also getting beyond compliance. Although there is legislation and there are requirements that we need to meet in certain areas, accessibility, human rights, and that we must do these things, but we want to get beyond compliance and we want to work towards the justice or equity case that I just described, so towards inclusion, because it's the right thing to do. People deserve to have equal opportunity. And in fact, that is married with some of the legal case, because we do have some legislation, Employment Equity Act and Human Rights, that pushes for that. But really moving towards the excellence and business case, it is the best thing to do. And that takes us to this notion, the concept of inclusive excellence. A lot of work has been done in this space in the US and also in the UK. And the inclusive excellence framework suggests that diversity and quality are two sides of the same coin, that in fact you cannot aspire to be as excellent as you would like to be if you are ignoring the diversity of talent that is out there. So this diagram attempts to depict the ways in which curiosity and creativity and innovation, which are necessary to stimulate quality, merit, and excellence, are hampered or not maximized if we're not thinking about a diverse and inclusive community. So I said I'm making these assertions, and so the question becomes, how do we back up these assumptions or assertions that we're making, and how do we start to make the case for EDI? Why we need to pursue this and pursue this vigorously? What the imperative is? Well, there's at least three assertions that we're making here. Number one, that a diversity of people and perspectives, when meaningfully included and engaged, they benefit higher education in individual and institutional ways, and that enhances academic, educational, organizational excellence. So we need to amass the evidence that demonstrates that, and there is evidence, a growing body of evidence that's demonstrating that. The second assumption or assertion is that certain peoples and perspectives continue to be underrepresented and underutilized in higher education as a consequence of persistent and powerful, what we will call individual personally mediated biases, as well as systemic structural and cultural inequities. And these act as barriers to the diversity and inclusion that we're trying to achieve in order to enhance our excellence. And the third assertion, which relates to, well, what are the solutions that we're going to propose, is that there are evidence-based best practices that demonstrate we need transformative system-wide personal, structural, and cultural EDI change efforts to be able to enable inclusive excellence. And these assumptions and assertions and the supporting evidence are being amassed and documented. I have an EDI strategy report as well as a supplement to lay out some of the evidence that's underpinning the EDI strategy that I'm going to talk to you about today that we're undertaking at McMaster. So let's just talk a little bit very briefly about the benefits of diversity. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the evidence, but just so that you know it's there. Milam, is one scholar for quite some time, has been looking at three dimensions of the benefits of diversity. The individual, institutional, societal benefits. So the ways that the educational experiences and outcomes of individual students are enhanced by the presence of diversity on campuses, the ways that the effectiveness of the organization is enhanced. So there's a lot of work on this in the corporate setting, and more scholars are looking at this in post-secondary environments. And then the ways in which the quality of life issues are improved in a larger society because of the diversity within our academy that impacts our local and global communities. So on the first two pieces, the individual and institutional, the research does demonstrate that inclusive campus climate is correlated positively with student learning outcomes. Diverse content in curriculum improves global citizenship and democracy outcomes, intercultural engagement and efficacy, critical and active thinking, and intellectual and academic motivation. And then diverse groups and learning contexts also have been shown to demonstrate a complexity of thought process. With respect to the organizational outcomes of the institution, just a few studies do show the same things that are being seen in corporate settings, that diverse teams promote creativity and innovation, and that greater gender and racial diversity, for example, creating more student-centered teaching and learning experiences, more diverse curricular offerings, more research that focuses on issues of race and gender, and more community engaged and service engagements. And there are many more. So this individual Herring scholar talked about the paradox with the benefits of diversity, which I think are really important for us to think about. So Herring says that a paradox exists with respect to the benefit of diversity, that greater diversity is associated with more intergroup or group conflict and better business performance. So this is great, because I think a lot of folks often ask the question, well, doesn't diversity create conflict or balkanize people? It's confrontational if we start to talk about our differences. Well, this study is recognizing that yes, as humans, there is going to be more group conflict, but it's not detracting from the better business performance if, there's a caveat, that if we develop capacities for people to manage those conflicts. So there's implications for intergroup relations work in order to leverage diversity. So this is the inclusion piece of the EDI proposition. So the scholar confirms that diverse groups are more prone to conflict, but that conflict can force us to go beyond our easy solutions and the diversity actually leads to contestation of different ideas, which is what we want in the academy, more creativity and superior solutions to problems, and ability to be more adaptable and innovative. But that doesn't come without some intentional and proactive work to be able to leverage the diversity and not avoid some of the conflict that may come up. So there's a little bit of information about the assertion that diversity benefits higher education. So on the issue of barriers to diversity and inclusion, there is quite a lot of literature now that's amassing. Most of it is being done in the space of looking at gender and racial bias and inequities in recruitment and retention of equity-seeking groups in Canadian and US schools. And I've just listed there a number of scholars that I've been looking at and will be referencing that look at this concept of bias and inequities as it relates to the experiences of faculty. There are some folks there listed that are looking at senior leaders in the academy. And then more studies over the last 2 and almost 3 decades looking at implicit and unconscious bias in multiple settings in any kind of evaluation setting. So looking at the bias in evaluating resumes and evaluating auditions. There's that famous study in terms of the blind auditions that demonstrated the profound gender bias. Evaluations in employment interview settings, in reference letter interpretations, in the evaluation of research excellence, job applicant qualities, and so on. And most recently, a book that's quite useful for the Canadian context, Frances Henry and her colleagues in 2017 wrote or put together a text called The Equity Myth. And it specifically is looking at the underrepresentation and underpay of Indigenous and racialized faculty. And that's quite useful because it not only talks about the qualitative experiences, but it actually is one of the few books that is looking at quantitative evidence. So I think that's useful. I think it's chapter 3 and 4 of that book, The Equity Myth, are quite useful. And I haven't even touched on the plethora of work on student access and success literature. So we have evidence that demonstrates that the biases and barriers exist, and we as individuals contribute and perpetuate these biases. It has nothing to do with our core values. Some of these are explicit biases and barriers, but many of these are invisible and hidden and unconscious to us. So in the space of looking at the barriers and how, what's the record, universities' record on representation of at least the workforce. This is one bit of data collection that we must do. It's necessary but insufficient. I'll say that a lot today. There's a lot of necessary but insufficient. They all kind of have to be working in tandem, but we do need to be, as a best practice, collecting workforce data, and the university, McMaster, has started to do that. This is the second year that we will be very shortly reporting on the census data that we have been collecting, and that looks at, whoops, sorry about that. That looks at the comparison between the self-identification, the voluntary self-identification of our members of our workforce, faculty and staff, who identify as women, Indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, and racialized persons, and then contrast that with labor market availability, notwithstanding the challenges we might have with the way that Statistics Canada might collect that data, but it is one bit of information we need to be mindful of. So on the basis of the last census, what this would tell us, one bit of information, is that we do have some gaps across the board with respect to our equity-seeking groups at the institution. And when you look at the delta with respect to the proportional gaps, they might look small. So it's helpful to look at something that's called the utilization rate. That when you look at self-ID data and census data and employment equity workforce data, the concept of utilization rate is really how far have we come to close the gap to achieve parity with the labor market availability. So you can see we're sort of 92, almost 92% of the way to closing the gap in terms of gender representation. We're only, according to this data, about a third of the way to closing the gap with Indigenous folks, much less with persons with disability, and maybe about 50, just over 50% with respect to racialized folks. And that's sort of across the board. And so what we're doing at McMaster is we're creating opportunities to be able to look at institutional data that is broken up, that's a little bit more helpful. Here's an example of the data that's broken up. It's institutional data, but it shows you differences now when you start to look at assistant professors, associate professors, full professors. The literature will tell us that, as individuals try to move up the ranks into leadership positions, we should see greater gaps. And that is actually bearing out in the data. You can start to see that amber there for women in full professors. We're only now 60% of the way to closing the gap in terms of full professors with respect to gender representation. And the red there is representing the greatest gaps, and we can see them for the institution. We see it in terms of persons with disabilities, but with Indigenous and racialized folks, we're only 2/3 of the way, and in some cases halfway closing the gaps. And this is then another visualization when you take that same chart, but now look at it for the Faculty of Health Sciences. We can do this for departments, but we are having to be very cautious, because at some point in the department, you're not going to see any numbers. You can see that less than 6. For privacy purposes, what we've determined, and many schools do this, is there's a particular threshold, a cutoff, where we won't report representation numbers for the sake of privacy and not being able to triangulate any data back to individuals. I do want to share that Melinda Smith, so more work is being done on this self-ID and what's it telling us, and representation. Melinda Smith, who's a colleague, a counterpart of mine, actually, she just got hired into the role similar to mine at the University of Calgary. She's been studying the representation in leadership. This is a depiction of a visualization of the representation. Specifically, she looked at racial, gender, and race, including Indigenous identity. When she did this in 2018, McMaster sort of was the lowest in the gender representation. I will say that as of 2019, although everyone else will have changed as well, we do have an interim scenario in terms of our vice presidents and the president's cabinet, that we do have a 50% representation by women, and we are entering into a hiring process now. So those will be important positions. With respect to deans, similarly, McMaster didn't fare so well if we're thinking of comparing with other schools. In 2019, though, again, we've done better in terms of enhancing our gender representation among deans, but also broadly, if we think about the representation of the deans across equity-seeking groups, we're doing okay in comparison. What's really important here is that we start to look at the gateway position. So we're trying to do a lot more work in doing some self-identification work at the director, chair level, any kind of position, either formal, and maybe we can track informal leadership positions. How diverse are those positions? Because what I have found sitting on recruitment and selection committees for senior roles, at some point it is almost too late, because the proxies for excellence in leadership that we're looking for, when we don't have Indigenous and racialized folks, we do have more women who have been able to get into those, if you want to call them, gateway positions to more senior leadership roles, but we're not seeing enough of that succession planning happening. So that's a real focus that needs to happen in our institution and across the sector. So we've laid out the point that there's lots of evidence to support that the barriers exist, and they're profound. And we haven't moved the dial as much as we can and should. Now we turn to looking at what's the evidence of the best practices, and what should we focus on. And the literature talks about transformative effort. What is, this terminology, transformative? What that means really is we have to look at systemic and structural interventions in order to have meaningful behavioral and cultural change. So these are paradigmatic shifts, right? So something that's transformational, we're looking at paradigm shifts, culture shifts, deep shifts. So these are some of the things that the literature will tell us we should do, and that I have seen in my practice work best. And these are the things that we're integrating in our strategy. And not just for the institution. I propose that at the departmental level, these are things that can be taken up. So strongly communicating the case and the imperative is really important. Debunking those myths and answering those questions about why are we doing this. We do need to still deliver what I say effective personal bias training. There's evidence that some training participants will say has not been effective. If it's not it's not the pedagogy, I would say, has not been really looked at. There are best practices with respect to what and how you should deliver equity, diversity, and inclusive training. So I think we need to focus still on making sure we're constructing very helpful training, but important. This is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We can't stop with just the training. So we have to provide equity training, again, with that worldview to be able to identify and address those structural systemic issues and barriers. We have to lean into examining and rethinking our systems policies, which include bylaws and our practices. And some of these are the unspoken norms. And I hear that quite often from the Faculty of Health Sciences. It's across the university as well, the academy, these who gets tapped in these very informal ways that protocols and practices happen that may not necessarily be in violation of a policy or procedure, because the policy and procedure perhaps has been silent on those normative practices. So we really have to interrogate those. We need to provide support in policy implementation. So not only do we need to make good policies, implementable policies, but then the implementation tools and resources need to come with those. We have to identify and support unit champions. This is critically important, that distributed leadership model. I'm one role, and I have a particular mandate to try to engage folks, to motivate, to inspire, but I need, the institution needs champions from senior leaders, as well as the champions on the ground. We need to be doing this as a collective. We need to invest in human, financial, material, temporal, technical resources. There's no doubt that some cost will come with this, and in times of scarcity, and now even this is an example during these COVID times. Well, we're seeing how EDI issues are manifesting in very different ways during these times, in very personal and individual ways, but we're all seeing that the amplification of social inequities in the institution. So we can't, we have to make sure that these issues remain top of mind. We need to understand and respond to local cultural structural issues and nuances. It's really important in the academy, because we pride ourselves in and appreciate the reality of being very decentralized, a decentralized institution. So we want to use that decentralization as a strength, not as a hindrance to doing the work that we do. And the only way to do that is have sort of a coordinated decentralized approach, but that we're not ignoring unique cultural departmental unit nuances, but addressing those and understanding them and ensuring that we have appropriate solutions. And of course, what gets measured gets done, as the saying goes. We need to measure, track our progress. And there's an assessment and evaluation implementation team at McMaster that is going to be going through a slew of qualitative and quantitative measures to look at which of these are we going to identify as our key performance indicators. And different departments, units locally may decide to track different kinds of things. And last but not least is modeling qualities of inclusive leadership. All of us can do this, regardless of our leadership positions, whether we hold in title a leadership position or large L or small L leadership roles. Okay, so I'm going to turn to talking about, now that I've sort of laid out what's the backdrop for these assumptions and assertions that I made. What are we doing about all of this? What's our strategy at McMaster? And I apologize for the fuzziness of this graphic. It's hot off the press. There's going to be a brochure posted very soon and distributed to the community. Over the last year, we've developed our EDI strategy, and this as well has been underpinned by best practice literature. And we have four pillars in our strategy to address our institutional commitment and our capacity, our organizational capacity, to address EDI issues in relation to academic content and context. That's number 2. And then our interactional capabilities, our competencies, and the way that we can influence our climate is going to be covered off in pillar 3. And last but not least, some of which I've already been alluding to, and some will say maybe should be number 1, is the compositional diversity and community. Is who's here, who's not here, and why, for the reasons that I spoke about. With that, this is one example, and there are 6 or 7 of these similar tables. This is an example of the table for Objective 6, which is in our EDI strategy to enhance the recruitment and retention of equity-seeking employees. And these are a few of the priorities we're focusing on. We've already launched our Employment Equity Facilitator program. This is a distributed model of training faculty and staff to be those equity facilitators to sit on search committees. We have developed a standardized search committee training that can be nuanced a little bit to different groups, but it has some particularly set aspects of the content. This is going back to figuring out what's effective and ensuring that we roll that out. And we are now rolling out institution-wide faculty hiring practices in association with the new recruitment and selection policy that was approved by the Senate and will come into effect July 1st. That is for MUFA faculty. I understand from my Faculty of Health Science colleagues that work is being done to look at the best practices there and how can we adapt or adopt some of those for other types of faculty appointments, and particularly those that have clinical affiliations as well. So it's a bigger, a different issue, but not impossible to think about. And we've also, you'll see that red check mark, we've begun work on thinking about opening up the tenure and promotion policy and practices, and thinking about those biases and embedded structural and procedural barriers there. So just an example. I can talk a little bit about the policy for faculty, for MUFA faculty handbook, some of the best practices that are now integrated in that policy and practice, and which we will be rolling out training for department chairs and equity facilitators. So as I mentioned before, we're assigning a trained equity facilitator for every search. We are requiring that the constitution of diverse search committees, and with ideally with a critical mass of equity seeking groups, notwithstanding the challenges in doing that, but we also have some suggestions for being creative around doing that. And by the way, there's a handbook associated with this policy as well. That's evolving with those tools and resources. Training all search committee members. So that's going to be a ramp up on unconscious and implicit bias. Reviewing workforce employment equity gaps. We have been working with human resources and institutional planning and analysis to create mechanism systems to easily pull up reports, so department chairs can and search committee chairs can request the employment data and have that available. We are requiring a signaling of our commitment to accessibility, employment equity, inclusive excellence in all our job ads. We are also requesting, we're not prescribing how people do this, but we're saying that whatever you decide with reference letters, ensure that you have a protocol and follow it to mitigate the bias. We're ensuring that we're casting a wide recruitment net and with both broad and targeted outreach. We're inviting self-identification for every search process, including senior leadership processes. I'm sitting on 3 of them now, and we're doing everything that I'm talking to you here about. We're trying to roll out in the senior search processes as well. And so we're requesting applicant diversity information. We're also requesting that individuals take time to submit a statement of contributions to EDI and inclusive excellence. And we're giving a bit of information about how they may do that. We're integrating EDI competencies in evaluation criteria. And we're integrating that. The handbook talks a little bit about how do you start to think about EDI competencies integrated with teaching and learning. What does it look like when it's integrated with the research? What does it look like integrated with service? And also integrated with leadership. We're discussing the evaluation decisions. This is a really important piece that it's not a quantitative or mathematical exercise of rating and scoring and ranking. That ranking and scoring is a means to an end, and part of that journey is actually going back and looking at how different people have rated and how bias and inequities may have factored into some of that rating. So that real frank conversations I have found to be the most helpful in enhancing both our process and outcomes. Monitoring diversity long lists and short lists. This is where we start now to get to really proactive equity measures, where we are being able to look at the diversity data and evaluate if people equity seeking groups are falling off in the long list stage, they're falling off in the short list stage, and they are, because that's part of the process. This is what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years. Those biases and barriers are quite powerful. And so there are ways that we're proposing for taking second looks in very ethical and not tokenistic ways that are forefronting excellence, that'll enable us not to lose talented equity seeking groups along the way. We're including interview questions that are concerned with EDI. Again, when we get to the end of our process, if we have more than one excellent candidates, then that's where we actually also think about our diversity makeup, our equity gaps, married with our inclusive excellence goals to make good decisions. And we're asking for some accountability, soft accountability. It's, there's a search summary report in the handbook that will just make sure that we have thought about all of these best practices that I just talked about, and this report allows us to, it enables my office and human resources to look at what's working, what's not working, where can we support departments more, how can we continuously improve. And then it doesn't stop there. We have to do the work to construct equitable offers of employment, and there's some work being done on what does that look like. And then the retention piece, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We recently, in one of our hires, interrogated or asked some of the applicants who declined to apply, and for some folks, the climate it will make a difference in their application. For others, it won't. But there were a few folks that who said they had a perception that maybe there wasn't support for equity seeking groups at McMaster. And so, you know, whether that's true or not, perception is reality. So we have to, I think, two things: is improve our profile and actually talk about the good things we're doing and the positive climate. I know there's lots of work for us to do, absolutely. So we're not hiding that, but also to talk about the good work we are attempting to do to improve climate. But then we need to deliver on that promise and actually work on retention and climate issues for folks. I'm going to skip on this, but just it's an example of a tool in the handbook that to help folks evaluate in their job search processes. We have mechanisms to talk about how to shepherd self-ID data so that we're committed to excellence and while being proactive with equity practices. So I won't go into that in detail so that we can have a little bit of time for some discussion. And I do want to say that I'm conducting a research project right now in the Faculty of Science. It's a case study. So we piloted as we were rolling out all of those best practices that I was talking to you about. So this is looking at the extent to which integrating best practices actually improves the outcomes in the diversity of the applicant pool, in the retention of diversity through the process, and in the selection of diversity hires. And also looking at the perceptions of search committee members and applicants, whether they believe that they noticed that we've done something with respect to EDI, and whether they believe that what we've done, they perceive that as contributing to fair, equitable, inclusive, and meritocratic processes. So we're just looking at the data now. There were 11 faculty search processes. So we looked at the participants or the committee members and the long listed applicants and the hires from those. It's a survey. It was closed and open-ended questions as well as the self-ID. We're also looking at content analysis. We're reviewing the EDI statements of contribution that folks have submitted to see what we're learning there. And then we have to track the diversity of new hires over time. Hopefully this pilot study can be rolled out in iterative versions in terms of longitudinal work on this as we start implementing the McMaster faculty policy. And last but not least, I will say, you know, what do we as individuals do in terms of mobilizing everything that I have just talked about? What is our role? We all have a responsibility at the institution to move EDI forward. I mean, certain folks in the institution have particular accountabilities, like myself, but we all have a responsibility. And this study by Deloitte, it was quite good. It was 2016. It was written. It was that the report was published. On the study where they looked at what were the qualities among leaders in organizations where EDI was successful, and they found these 6 qualities. And so you know, this commitment to our own personal values, valuing EDI, and the belief in the case for both social justice as well as the business case is really important, and we need to work on that. If we still have any questions about that and our commitment isn't quite there, there's opportunities to develop that. With that, we need to have courage, which is the humility to know or to be able to admit to what it is that we don't know, and seek out how to know that information, and oftentimes humility and is a part of that, and the courage to delegate and the courage to defer to sometimes equity seeking groups that have information or have a lived experience or have some information that can can be provided, and then having the courage as well to take on changing the status quo at the institution. Cognizance refers to or is referring to the need for us to interrogate those biases I talked about, where we have unconscious or implicit biases that we come into consciousness, right? That we have a commitment to be much more mindful and to dig into uncovering those hidden biases and inequities that we may be contributing to. Curiosity is constantly wanting to learn more and be open to new ideas and new perspectives, leveraging those new ideas and perspectives that come with diversity, enabling growth by taking on an empowerment way of being and supporting teamwork. Cultural intelligence refers to both cultural specific knowledge, so amassing knowledge about different cultural nuances, specific cultural nuances, but also kind of, I could say, cultural general patterns of behavior, but also the ways that inequities manifest in societies and in culture. And then finally, collaboration, last but not least, are the ways that we can work together and engage each other. And this is again back to the coordinated decentralization, ensuring that we have teams to move this forward. So I will stop there, and I think I've left us about 10 minutes, but there's a lot of chat here that I'll turn it to you, Mark, to let me know where to start with these questions.
Thanks very much. So just before we go on the chat, I've asked Sonia and Will, who've been helping us with this in the department, if they could make a few comments about the department's approach to this. So Sonia, then Will.
Great. Thank you very much, Arig. It's great to see you and hear you. And as you know, and many of the department members know, that over the past couple of years, we've implemented some of the strategies that you have alluded to. So in particular, our selection committee processes, we've tried to adapt and standardize, as well as leadership positions, posting them and making the process of application quite transparent. So I think we've made a number of changes over the past couple of years, and for the most part, they've been well received. And even, you know, when people don't always agree, we've had some really good discussions that I think you also allude to is important, to have a diversity of opinions on the issues. And I think our strategy has been to measure where we're at, innovate, and then remeasure and see how we're doing. And that's been, that's kind of our model, which is great. Sometimes you may be familiar with the idea that the outside game is easier than the inside game. So the outside game are all of the things that you mentioned and some of the strategies we've implemented. But day to day, there are challenges for people sitting around discussion tables, as well as in their clinical teams, where people in leadership may make comments that are perceived to be, you know, could be racist, could be sexist, could be, we don't believe that there's a myth of meritocracy. We think we've become leaders because we're the best, and equity threatens that notion. So it's challenging to play the inside game. There are a number of people who do, but the challenge is the cognitive load of continuing to bring up, well, perhaps things aren't perfect. Maybe we should look at, you know, the equity or inequities in what we do. So any comments you would like to make on that, because we need both. We need the structural change, most certainly, but there is the ongoing challenge of the everyday discussion table, clinical team, etc., that I know my colleagues find challenging.
Isn't there a saying that culture eats strategy for lunch?
Something like that. Maybe.
Yeah, something. Yeah, I think that's what this means. So absolutely, yeah. It's the constant push, and this is where it comes back to. I mean that leadership, individual leadership, and particularly people who, you know, I said we all have a responsibility, but those of us in positional leadership at the institution, particularly if we have said that EDI is a priority and we have evidence, we have best practices. At this point, we are starting to think about ensuring that when we're bringing folks into these positions, that they're already coming with some fluency in this. So it's not, you're not having to fight the battle of convincing, at least at the leadership level. But then, in the institution, absolutely, we're almost like a number of different sole proprietors. And I guess that's the case in health sciences as well. We have a lot of clinicians. But I think that it's the extent to which we can make small and then larger culture shifts. It's going to start with groups. Who are can we uncover what are the challenges people are facing with respect to saying anything, doing anything? Let's understand what those challenges are, the climate, and figure out how to, in any small way, create opportunities where things can be said and things can be acted upon. It is about a culture change. There needs to be accountabilities for some of those. I think what I said was there are these practices that are happening informally, but no accountability around them, right? So all of these measures can create the structure that we need, but we do, as individuals, need to look at, if we have a climate of silence, if we have folks that are not willing to point out that some things are happening that are not right, or we don't have leaders that are challenging folks, I think we're not going to move forward. I said boldly that someone asked the question, if there is on a search committee someone who is just adamant that they're objective, that they don't have biases, what do you do in that case? I said that I don't know that person should be on the search committee, right? And so, okay, what do people think about that? And why do we have, if we believe that these, that the barriers exist and there are best practices, but we have very strong, voices, and sometimes that take us hostage. It can be one person among 10 that's taking us hostage. We need to have leadership to change that. I mean, there's so much more to say about that, but thank you for raising it.
Yeah, thank you. I know there's lots of other questions, so perhaps Will, you can go next.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's so important, the work that you're doing. Thanks for bringing this to the department. And obviously, Sonia and I have been working on this for a couple of years now, and my perspectives are obviously different. I think you've entered a real dangerous area because, I think where people bristle is this concept of the myth of meritocracy, because you're in the heart of evidence-based medicine, and where, we spend so much time thinking about, evidence and at the highest levels, particularly empirical evidence. And that's sort of bearing out in this whole issue with the research that's going on for COVID, for instance. But I think it's important to point out the difference. What we're arguing here is not that there is no such thing as merit. It's this conception that the meritocracy is perfect when it clearly is not. And what we're saying is that there isn't as big a competency differential between people being selected. And so the question is, what do you do about that? And I think the biggest issue I have with the implicit association test unconscious bias training is exactly what you say. Is it's supposedly necessary but insufficient. But the truth is, when you look at the literature, it's pretty insufficient. It just doesn't work. And so all it's doing is propagating changes in people's ideology, but not actually affecting health for the people that are equity challenged. And so from that perspective, I think we need to move on to other solutions. And even the EDI literature usually suggests moving on to an equity aspect. And I think the problem I have with equity is there are times when it's necessary and times when it could be dangerous. And I think you've shown it in your data here. We have some data where we can look at our own Faculty of Health Sciences and know that for certain racialized groups like South Asians and East Asians, it hasn't been as much of an issue. For gender, it hasn't been as much of an issue until we get to the highest levels. But there are certain groups like Indigenous and Black people that are, you know, I think we really do need an equity perspective. And so a couple of things we're looking at is what is the actual specific populations that need to be having an equity solution? And then also, what about your population as well in terms of what they're doing? I think we've got some literature now showing that for the clinician educators, there may not be as big a difference in terms of the competency as much as in people who are doing different types of work, like research, for instance, where there's a very different frequency distribution, Gaussian versus non-Gaussian. And I think looking at these things, you have to have creative different solutions at how you solve these problems. And so I'm very encouraged by the work you're doing. And I hope that we can bring some creative solutions. And that's what Sonia and I have been working on in terms of the DAVNA approach, but we can get into that maybe offline.
Yeah, no, that's great, William. You're doing exactly what you are supposed to do, is just disaggregate the data and really dig into the differences in terms of the challenges and problems, and then nuance the solutions. Absolutely. And the ideal would be if different disciplines actually did that for their different communities, and with that as well as, I think, looking at, quote, pipeline issues. What are the different pipeline issues for different disciplines as well? That's a source of identifying some different kinds of challenges.
Maybe just in the interest of time, we'll take some of the questions from the floor just quickly. Just before we start, though, I've been asked again to present the code for those who are on their phone. The code for today's rounds are C as in Charlie, H as in Hotel, 6463. So CH6463. I'm going to aggregate a couple of questions. And maybe the only question we'll take from the floor, just given the time, is one of the things I think people get worried about are quotas. And so the specific questions are: quotas an appropriate strategy for enforcing EDI, and how do you balance that with the merit argument? And that's a flavor of a bunch of different questions that are probably all related. Before Riga, I'll ask you to maybe give some thoughts on that. Before that, Ann Holbrook's just asked, do we have evidence that we've accomplished something in the Department of Medicine? And you can rest assured that Sonia and Will are tracking this very carefully, and they can present you with some data offline, which I think would suggest we're having some fairly significant success. And certainly we're very carefully monitoring these issues in all of the selections and hires that we do. So even if we haven't moved the ball as far as we want to right now, we certainly will be able to tell you how far we moved the ball with a high degree of accuracy. So maybe, Riga, I could ask you to just comment on this issue of quotas and how you override, how you pick groups, which groups should be picked, and how you can implement or not implement that kind of a system.
So what I talked about today is not akin to quota. So I'm trying to get, and this is going to be a very good question to perhaps put right out there for folks, and probably post it on our website. An answer to the is this a quota, or are we pursuing quotas? No. So our day-to-day hiring should not be viewed as and my view is that we don't pursue a quota process. We are starting with and leading with our need for particular excellent qualifications. And what we're trying to do is remove barriers so employment equity is really about removing the barriers so that more individuals can be looked at. And it's about thinking more expansively about the way that we have been assessing excellence. And I think William was alluding to this, is that the proxies that we're currently using as measures of excellence are steeped in bias and inequities. And so we have to interrogate those and make sure we are actually thinking as expansively as possible for the correct proxies for excellence. So we're not compromising excellence, we're just thinking of it more accurately and unencumbering our evaluative mechanisms. So that allows more diverse people and perspective to move through our search processes. At the end of a process, if we have, as I said, more than one candidate who, and it's not a race, so it's not the person who had the most numerically had the highest score, but it's two or is it two or more people that were within this what we call zone of excellence. And again, as William has said, there's very small nuances at that stage between a person's capacity to actually succeed in this role and do really well. In that case, we're then looking at, look, if we have two excellent candidates and one of them represents a group that is severely underrepresented in our community, that's employment equity supports that. So we're not compromising excellence, and it's not a quota system. There's a whole other proposition when you start to look at strategic hiring practices, targeted hiring, and that's different than what I've talked about today.
Great, thanks very much. Just looking at the time, we probably should wrap up. I'd just like to thank Dr. El-Sheba for her time and presentation today and for the questions. A great set of rounds. We had 74 people online, mostly faculty, which is huge attendance for grand rounds. So thanks very much for the rounds, and I'm sure you'll get additional feedback. And again, we will post this on our YouTube channel probably later on today if anybody else wants to have a look at it. So thanks very much for attending. Thank you, Arig, for presenting, and great presentation, very clear, and I think really reinforces some of the goals we have in the department.
Thank you, Mark. And I wonder if I can get is there a possibility of getting the questions that were in?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
yep.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks all.